The skill you're talking about with sitting and clicking like this is not even the same as the skill of aiming and shooting a ball through the hoop, right? It's also not the same as holding a gun and pulling the trigger. And you're utterly refusing to engage in an opportunity cost analysis. And what you have to recognize is, even when you have these measurable outcomes for video games supposedly giving you skills and the ability to focus on problem solving, what is the type of skill you're developing? What is the type of problem you're learning to focus on? You're only learning to focus on video games. That's the tragedy of it. And as I say, that's even true of this program I have on this phone, where this is not helping me to actually go and face-to-face in real time verbally communicate with a Chinese person. It's also not helping me to sit with a pen, a paintbrush, and write out Chinese. There are all kinds of things it's not training me for. It's only training me to sit down and write that one exam, right? There is a vast gap between this world of simulated diversions, the so-called skills, the so-called problem solving you're learning to engage in there, and any possible meaningful application of problem solving in your real life. And if you don't believe me, if you're really skeptical, if you really believe that no, you're building up amazing hand-eye coordination through video games, have you ever fucking heard about an Olympic champion who becomes the world's greatest in archery saying, yeah, you know what really helped me? Playing video games. That's what helped me build up my skills in archery. Have you ever heard a basketball player say anything like that? Have you ever heard any person who accomplished anything in any form of skill that requires hand-eye coordination thanking video games for helping them? Have you ever heard about a boyfriend or girlfriend who worked through their problems, who had problem solving in the relationship, face-to-face, emotionally intense, difficult problem solving, say, you know, it sure is a good thing I spent 10 years of my life playing video games for 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, because that really helped me to be able to sit down with my girlfriend face to face and work this out and solve this problem. Do you ever hear anyone in business management say, yeah, the problems I deal with as a business manager, it sure is a good thing I spent 10 years of my life playing video games for 3 hours a day, because now I'm so skilled at focusing my mind, hearing people's problems, gathering the data, engaging in an analysis, getting out there and solving problems. No, you never hear that, because the anecdotal evidence reflects the banality of the scientific claim that's being made here. Playing video games trains you in absolutely no skill other than wasting your time playing video games. We live in a world where more and more of what we can possibly know, more and more of what we can prove with a footnote to a peer-reviewed reference, derives from the world of rather silly, short-term, self-serving social science research. Social science research projects that are set up largely to generate more master's degrees and PhD theses and to have kind of reliable, predictable outcomes that more or less confirm something we knew through common sense, knowledge, or intuition anyway. There was a study, I can't give you the footnote, there was a study, trust me on this, there was a study examining whether or not people could learn to accurately shoot a basketball hoop, throw a basketball through the hoop, whether they could learn to shoot hoops, as we say, without actually using a basketball and a hoop. Like whether or not you could give people lectures and show them a diagram on the chalkboard and talk them through like the theory and the physics, and that they could improve their ability to use a basketball compared to people learning empirically, hands-on. Now, there were various conclusions from that study. It's not completely worthless, but it's this slightly silly world of research projects that are set up because it's like, well, we need something where we can do all the research within about 3 months. We can get government funding. We can give a bunch of people master's degrees for doing this. There are certain institutional constraints that keep generating these types of findings, these types of investigations. And, this is added to the corpus of evidence that, you can't learn how to shoot hoops. You can't learn how to do well in basketball without actually handling a basketball. Now, they actually did also prove that you learn more rapidly if you have the book learning also. Like empirical experience alone, without a coach talking you through the theory and showing you on a chalkboard how it works, is less efficient than having both. but they tested all this in separate groups. People who just had empirical experience, people who had both theory and hands-on experience, and people with the hands-on experience with no theory. So you can imagine, there's an ever-growing corpus of evidence that the problem with IQ tests, the problem with written exams, is not that they don't test your ability, but that they only test your ability to write that kind of exam. So likewise, the type of skills you build up in playing a video game, those are skills that are really only useful for playing video games or even for playing that one genre of video games. And on some level, we intuitively know this. We know that it's hard to switch from one video game to another. And we know that playing a video game about surviving in the woods doesn't prepare you to actually survive in the woods. We know that playing a video game that simulates basketball does not improve your ability to play basketball in any way. You don't gain the manual skills or understanding or depth perception or timing to actually shoot hoops by sitting on a couch holding a controller. So the type of email I get defending video games, what it ends up defending instead is the very narrow use of testing, and testing that just barely resembles a video game. So this is what you could call a video game that's on my cell phone. You could call this a game. In reality, what this is a simulated exam. So you could say this is a game. There's a multiple choice test. It tells you a word in Chinese, then you have to select the correct characters for it. Now, this game or this test on my phone is meant to directly mimic a system of examinations created and defined by the government of China. It's called the HSK exam system. So each game you're playing there trains you to be able to sit down and write an exam. And the actual exam is done sitting at a computer terminal. It's not on paper. To my knowledge, they do it now completely digitally. So you pay like $300. It's quite expensive. You sit down at a computer terminal, and it presents you with basically exactly the same interface. Here's the question, multiple choice answer, so on and so forth. The problem, this relates directly to the inadequacy of the IQ test in measuring intelligence and the inadequacy of video games in preparing you for real-world challenges, so on and so forth. The problem is, I could spend the time mastering that game, mastering that video game. I could spend the time mastering how to do well on that exam, and my ability to understand that word when I actually hear it spoken to me in Chinese is zero. Now, admittedly, Chinese is an extraordinarily difficult language. I wouldn't even say that about Italian. Probably if you learn Italian this way, it's pretty easy to take the information you're learning on the exam and apply it to real life. But Chinese, the gap between knowledge of Chinese on paper, doing well with Chinese on an exam, and being able to actually write an essay in Chinese, write an article in Chinese, or have listening comprehension, or in a split second to hear what somebody says, understand it, and respond in verbal Chinese, it's a huge gap. And likewise, there is a huge gap between understanding how to score points in basketball from what's written on a chalkboard and how to actually have the tactile experience in real life with all the distractions and all the people around you. Okay? So I received sort of two passionate sets of hate mail or fan mail from people trying to defend video games. One defense that I think we can deal with pretty briefly, and in principle, I have the same response to both of them. But this background is important to the problem. The background being that if you want to test someone's ability in something, you need the test to mimic the actual action, the actual responsibility, the actual job as closely as possible. All right? And this has been found through academic research, and a lot of it is through the trial and error of government institutions. Like, there was a time when people thought you could use the IQ test, you could use general tests of intelligence, to figure out who would be good at being a firefighter. Like, you can hire people for the fire department on the basis of giving them an exam that it may actually be the IQ test or something similar they invented, right? Like, here's basically a kind of watered-down IQ test plus some questions about what's the correct way to assemble a hose, get the hose and pump water through it. Maybe there's some questions related. And you know what? That's a terrible test. It works really badly. It completely fails to select people who would be good for the job. If you want to know who's going to be a good firefighter, you have to set up a test that actually very directly mimics the conditions of putting out a fire as closely as possible. Same way, you could imagine if you set up a test for who would be a good basketball player, you basically want to have a series of, set up an obstacle course that very closely resembles the actual actions, the actual job that you're testing their ability to do. So this has been seen, kind of across the board. This has been seen in many, many fields, including fields that involve paper and pencil, but where nevertheless standardized testing may utterly fail to reflect, capture who is really good at doing this job that involves paper and pencil. So this is this is a kind of time bomb for the Western education system, because in many cases we have systems of examination set up that in no way resemble, and they result in people training themselves, like this application on my phone I just showed you, training themselves to have a skill set that only very obliquely relates to the kind of capability or ability you're supposedly training for. So one person wrote into me saying that the playing of video games can be justified or should be justified because it can inspire people to take more of an interest in history. Okay? So let's concede this point. Somebody can play a video game for 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, and because they play that video game, they develop an interest in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, World War II, maybe medieval China, all these things, maybe medieval Japan, samurai fighting in Japan. These are all historical settings that exist in video games, right? Okay. And again, I'm not using an extreme case of video game addiction. In the 21st century, most people seem to think that playing a video game for 3 hours a day, they think that's not an addiction. They think that's not, it's not the same as someone playing for 12 hours a day, I admit, okay? So I concede the point. You can be inspired. You can develop an interest in history from playing a video game. But the error you're making here, twofold. One, what I've already mentioned, that the type of ability you're developing remains still clicking on a controller to try to get that response, get that outcome, whatever it is in the particular game. It may be a puzzle game, it may be an action game, it may be a strategy game, it may be a fighting game, okay? Look, you don't learn how to survive in a real-world fist fight by playing a video game that simulates people punching each other in the face. You just don't. You don't build up those skills at all. Now, conversely, you can look at flight simulators that are actually used in the industry to train people to fly an airplane, and then you get into these issues where they are trying to mimic the real-world activity of flying an airplane, and guess what? It's not fun. It's not a game anymore. It's not entertaining. It's just a flight simulator. And I believe there are actually, for training people with accuracy with a gun, there are also shooting simulators. I heard about that in the news many, many years ago, that the military and police in some places, they use a sort of very boring, very accurate video game to help people train using a revolver or using a rifle accurately, where they're shooting at something, right? So the point is, again, not that that's impossible, but that is not what people are doing 3 hours a day. They are not developing a useful skill set. And then secondly, you're engaging in a kind of subtle form of fallacious reasoning because you're not considering the opportunity cost, right? A video game, you claim, the person who wrote into me claimed, can cultivate your interest in world history. How effective a use of your time is that? 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, compared to just watching history documentaries, TV documentaries, made for TV documentary films about the same period of history for 3 hours a day, 7 days a week. I honestly think I can rest my case and appeal to the common sense of the audience. The quantity of learning you would gain if you seriously sat down, you would have to watch every single documentary that has ever been made about ancient Rome and ancient Greece. But just sitting and watching TV, on nonfiction TV, educational TV, on that one topic, 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, you would, with time, gain a massive, if very shallow, knowledge of that history. Probably very repetitious also. But you'd encounter some of the same facts again and again, okay? So the educational value you're claiming for playing a video game this way, if we're not even comparing this to hitting the books and studying in an assiduous way. We're not comparing this to getting a master's degree, which may indeed. Most people getting MAs and PhDs, I don't think they even study for 3 hours a day, 7 days a week. I really don't. I've known a lot of those people. It's very rare for them to hit the books that much. But okay, we're not comparing this to getting a master's degree. We're not comparing this to even studying and writing your own essay on the topic. But just compared to the passive entertainment of watching documentary films, I think the other side of the argument has to throw in the towel and say, yes, even if we're arguing that video games have more than zero educational content, these video games we're talking about, it's so close to zero, it can't even be compared to watching a documentary. Again, when I say these video games we're talking about, I mean blockbuster, AAA titles, I mean Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, Xbox. I don't mean a police simulator, a flight simulator or shooting simulator. I don't mean the type of incredibly boring game I just showed you on my phone here, which is really just an examination transferred into gamified format. Okay, so I had another guy write into me, and he's engaged in the same form of fallacious reasoning, where he tries to claim that playing video games, all right, I think there are about 3 claims here. One, that it improves your hand-eye coordination, and he has a link, and it's not to real science, it's not to peer-reviewed studies, it's to some bullshit news website saying, oh, some people say you can improve your hand-eye coordination for video games. Okay, so the claim that it improves your hand-eye coordination, the claim that it improves your ability to focus on like problem solving or focus on a task, on a difficult task, these sorts of claims that there's a redeeming quality to sitting and playing video games for 3 hours, you are not preparing yourself to actually score points in basketball, right? That is a different set of hand-eye coordination reflexes, right? Like if you're going to make the claim that you improve your dexterity, your manual skills, right? The skill you're talking about with sitting and clicking like this is not even the same as the skill of aiming and shooting a ball through the hoop, right? It's also not the same as holding a gun and pulling the trigger. And you're utterly refusing to engage in an opportunity cost analysis. Sorry, to me, this guy writing it, that's why you sound like an idiot. You can't discuss playing video games as if the alternative is just to not exist for those 3 hours. If you spent those 3 hours instead practicing knife throwing, I'm from Canada, there are still guys who really practice knife throwing in Canada. You take a hunting knife and learn to throw it. There are guys in Canada who will boast that they defended themselves against a bear attacking them through their knife throwing skills. Okay, if you practice knife throwing, if you go hunting, fishing, boating, kayaking, almost any activity you can imagine will develop hand-eye coordination. But beyond this, what if you intentionally designed a program of activity because your goal was to increase your hand-eye coordination? You wouldn't want to be increasing this. It wouldn't be this form of hand-eye coordination, sitting and pressing a button. No. If you were actually trying to train yourself with the same amount of time, and then you compared the efficacy of that to video games, you would have an unbelievably dramatic contrast. It would be a far more extreme contrast in outcomes than comparing the casual watching of documentaries about the history of ancient Rome to playing a video game that happens to be set in ancient Rome, right? So the value of playing a video game for your alleged development of your attention span and your hand-eye coordination, we can't compare that to nothing and say, oh, look, it has more than zero impact on their ability to solve problems through hand-eye coordination. How about baking? How about knitting? How about sewing? Okay, do you have experience stitching? Do you have experience weaving fabric? All right, if you do that for 3 hours a day, that kind of work, you don't think you develop your acumen? You don't think you develop hand-eye coordination? And again, it's a different set of skills, your ability to actually sew something. Okay, if you compare video games to almost any activity that would improve, your ability to focus on a problem, solve a problem, and your ability to have hand-eye coordination, it is going to pale in comparison. This is a refusal to do that. You're evaluating the video game as having more than zero value with no kind of real-world referent to some other viable possible outcome. And above all else, you're refusing to compare it to someone who has the ambition to actually accomplish something in the given area, whether it's history or hand-eye coordination. Like, do you want to be a champion at throwing darts? Do you want to be a champion at bowling? Do you want to be a champion at throwing a javelin? These are all different forms of hand-eye coordination. Do you actually want to be decent at aiming and firing a bow and arrow or something? What is it you want to train? and someone who's then seriously and assiduously training for that ability, there is no comparison here to the hand-eye coordination your so-called scientific study establishes of someone sitting and staring at a screen and doing this, timing their ability to move their thumbs back and forth to make something blow up on screen. Again, what evidence do you want me to appeal to here? The outcomes ultimately are going to be non-comparable because the skill you're developing, again, as I said earlier about the nature of intelligence tests, it will only be applicable to a scenario that's closely comparable to it. So if you want to train yourself to be able to throw basketball hoops, if you want to train yourself to be a firefighter or to be a soldier, you need to work through simulated scenarios that closely resemble that. If you want to train yourself to be a scholar and an author who writes books about history, you've got to do activities that closely resemble that work. You've got to build yourself up to writing your first book about history by researching and writing shorter essays on specific topics. You can imagine the way in which you build up the acumen to do that. And what you have to recognize is, even when you have these measurable outcomes for video games supposedly giving you skills and the ability to focus on problem solving, what is the type of skill you're developing? What is the type of problem you're learning to focus on? You're only learning to focus on video games. That's the tragedy of it. And as I say, that's even true of this program I have on this phone, where this is not helping me to actually go and face-to-face in real time verbally communicate with a Chinese person. It's also not helping me to sit with a pen, a paintbrush, and write out Chinese. There are all kinds of things it's not training me for. It's only training me to sit down and write that one exam, right? There is a vast gap between this world of simulated diversions, the so-called skills, the so-called problem solving you're learning to engage in there, and any possible meaningful application of problem solving in your real life. And if you don't believe me, if you're really skeptical, if you really believe that no, you're building up amazing hand-eye coordination through video games, have you ever fucking heard about an Olympic champion who becomes the world's greatest in archery saying, yeah, you know what really helped me? Playing video games. That's what helped me build up my skills in archery. Have you ever heard a basketball player say anything like that? Have you ever heard any person who accomplished anything in any form of skill that requires hand-eye coordination thanking video games for helping them? Have you ever heard about a boyfriend or girlfriend who worked through their problems, who had problem solving in the relationship, face-to-face, emotionally intense, difficult problem solving, say, you know, it sure is a good thing I spent 10 years of my life playing video games for 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, because that really helped me to be able to sit down with my girlfriend face to face and work this out and solve this problem. Do you ever hear anyone in business management say, yeah, the problems I deal with as a business manager, it sure is a good thing I spent 10 years of my life playing video games for 3 hours a day, because now I'm so skilled at focusing my mind, hearing people's problems, gathering the data, engaging in an analysis, getting out there and solving problems. No, you never hear that, because the anecdotal evidence reflects the banality of the scientific claim that's being made here. Playing video games trains you in absolutely no skill other than wasting your time playing video games.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.